Thanks very much for inviting me. Real pleasure to be here talking to you guys today. And I should say, as I said to you on the walk from the car park, you've got a great lineup of speakers for this event. So well done for that. That's really good. And I know you've got Professor David Nutt after me this afternoon, so I can tell you I'm very much the warm-up act for today, because David is he's the global superstar when it comes to drugs and drug policy, and he's a great speaker, and you will learn an awful lot from him. Some of the things I think I'm going to talk about, he is also going to go into, and probably in a bit more detail. So I'm going to give you sort of top level stuff when it comes to things like drug policy and war on drugs and stuff like that. What I really want to do is talk to you about the work that we're doing at Drug Science, and how we're trying to make a difference and trying to make sure people have the right information about drugs, scientific evidence, not the stuff you might hear from either the government or the media, or from people who don't really want to look at the truth about drugs, because that's our tagline at Drug Science: the truth about drugs, and it's what we're all about. So my name's David Badcock. I'm the Chief Executive of Drug Science, been at the organisation for about 4.5 years or so. I don't know if do people know about Drug Science? Have you heard of us? Yep. Okay, so the organisation was created by David Nutt just about 11 or 12 years ago now, I think. And you might know the backstory to that, but David used to be the chief advisor to the government on drugs, to the then Labour government. He was the chair of the ACMD, which stands for the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, which is the official government body that is supposed to look at drugs, review evidence, and advise on drug policy. It's supposed to be independent, but it seems to me, and this is my personal opinion here, that the government doesn't really take notice of what the ACMD's recommendations are quite often, and quite often it kind of puts its own political priorities above looking at the evidence base when it comes to drugs and drug harms, and also the therapeutic potential of drugs. So anyway, David used to be the chair, but he was controversially sacked from that position because he was trying to tell the truth about drugs. He had that well-known thing that he said, which was basically, he said a few things, but he's basically said horse riding was more dangerous than taking ecstasy. He was absolutely correct about that. Statistically, more people die from horse riding, quite a lot more actually, die from horse riding than from taking ecstasy or MDMA. And he kind of said it just to kind of illustrate a point, the point being that drug policy wasn't working and it wasn't evidence-based and it needed to change. And that's the reason he kind of made that provocative statement. But basically the government couldn't handle it. The health secretary then, the Home Secretary was Alan Johnson. And he dismissed David off the back of that and said, you can't have our chief advisor kind of saying these types of things. But it's just telling the truth. It's what he was doing. But the government didn't like it. So he sacked David, and then all of his colleagues on the ACMD basically resigned in protest en masse. So they all left because they just kind of totally supported David, didn't like what had happened at all. And as an alternative to the ACMD, he then said they together set up this like a rival group, you could say, which has no kind of connections to government, no connections to commercial industries, or completely independent. And at that time, it was called the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs. And the point of it was to try and kind of dispel all the stuff that the government was saying and do it in an independent way and be able to say what it wants without being kind of gagged by the government. It later became Drug Science. We had a name change, so now known as Drug Science. And the group is made up of, without any doubt, the most accomplished and authoritative and respected scientists, academics, and policy experts on the subject of drugs. So if you compare Drug Science now to the ACMD, in my opinion, and I think in many people's opinion, there is no comparison. Drug Science has expertise, science and academic expertise at the very highest level. The ACMD have people who will say the right things for the government, essentially, and that's the way that I see it. But anyway, so drug science is doing loads of stuff now. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it. But I thought to begin with, just to kind of set some context on kind of why we're in this situation and why an organization like Drug Science needs to exist. So it's all about the war on drugs, and I'm very sure everybody in here knows what the war on drugs is and is familiar with it. Essentially a war that's been going for at least 50 years, possibly the last 100 years or so, but certainly at least 50 years in the way that we kind of know it right now. War on drugs is essentially kind of the ethos behind it is saying all drugs are bad, anybody who takes drugs are bad people, and anybody who does so should be punished. That's essentially what the war on drugs is. It kind of under this facade, really, that having that approach is the best possible way to tackle the problem of drugs. So 50 years, where have we got to? The world has spent over $1 trillion on this effort. It's claimed over 300,000 lives. I think that's actually probably quite a low estimate. It's probably way more than that. Certainly destroyed millions and millions of lives. If not people dying, it's destroyed their lives. Destabilized many countries, particularly those in places like South America and countries who are, at the start of the whole supply chain of drugs. It's been particularly bad. But despite all of that, it's had negligible impact. That people are not stopping from taking drugs, and in fact, it's had the kind of the reverse effect in many ways, where it's supposedly trying to prevent harm. It has caused far more harm than ever would have happened otherwise, and I'll talk through why that is in a little bit. If you look at the UK. So we currently criminalise 40,000 people every single year for drug-related offences. And many of those people will get a custodial sentence in jail, and that can be anything from being caught in possession of maybe small quantities of any particular drug, all the way through to dealers and suppliers and people involved in the whole supply chain. But 40,000 people put in jail, which costs a huge amount of money. One of the big problems we have in this country, and not dissimilar to other countries, it disproportionately affects people, for particularly black people and young adults. So if you're a young black man, you are much more likely to get a conviction for a drug offence than you are if you are a white man, for instance, and it disproportionately affects people from those communities for no good reason whatsoever. We spend $1.6 billion a year on drug law enforcement. It's a huge sum of money, especially at this time. And again, just like on the global scale, it has not had any positive impact. It has not worked. And we have seen an increase in drug-related deaths year on year for the last 10 or 15 years, I think it's been now. Every single year, drug-related deaths are increasing. So this war on drugs, this prohibition policy that we have, clearly isn't working. So where did that start? Just very quickly, and as I said at the start, David Nutt is going to talk about this stuff in more detail after my talk this afternoon, so I won't go into loads of detail on it, but just to kind of say, it kind of started with Robert Nixon back in 1971. America's public enemy number one in the United States is the drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it's necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. Why did he say that? It was because he had two problems. He had the liberal anti-war left, who were very much opposed to the soon-to-come Vietnam War, and he also had the black community who were using drugs, particularly like cannabis. and he wanted to quell both of those groups of people. And he decided to use drugs as the focal point to do that. So he wanted the anti-war people to not take LSD and love life and be happy. He wanted them to support the war, and he wanted to demonize black people by saying that they really wanted to use marijuana, as he called it back then, which is a very stigmatizing word for cannabis. And he wanted to take on both of those groups, and that's why he started this war on drugs, and led to the very start of the criminal approach to every aspect. Nancy Reagan then kind of took it up a notch. When President Ronald Reagan was the president, she kind of took on this Just Say No campaign. Are people familiar with Just Say No, this campaign? So I remember this because I was, at that time, I was like 9 years old, I think. And it kind of like, I can really remember how this campaign had an impact on me. I believed it completely. There was this program called Grange Hill back in my day, and they did this storyline where one of the characters became addicted to heroin, and it became like really kind of like big awareness around this problem. And I remember the whole kind of rhetoric around this was, drugs are bad, and if you take them, it means you're a weak, ill-moraled person, and you shouldn't do it. If you do take drugs, you are going to end up a drug addict. You're going to end up maybe dead as a result, and it's a really bad, evil thing to do. So it all came from Nancy Reagan, and she says here, understanding what drugs can do to your children, understanding peer pressure, and understanding why they turn to drugs is the first step in solving the problem. Now that quote, she's absolutely right. That is exactly what we do need to do, right? We need to speak to our children and young people, and make sure that they know the truth about drugs, scientific evidence, and that they can make an informed choice about what they do based on the evidence. They can make a choice. It's informed, and therefore it's a much better way to do it. So she's right about what she says, but the whole just say no thing is completely the wrong way to go about it, because she's basically saying, she says that, and then she says, but just say no, and that's it. Because if you take drugs, you're a bad person. And this is quite stigmatizing, because what this is saying is, if you can't just say no, which of course people who have problematic drug use they can't say no, they often have an addiction problem. If you can't just say no, you're a weak-willed person with no moral compass, and why can't you just say no? And so that's led to an awful lot of the stigma that we still have today when people want to talk about drugs. They can't, because there's all this stigma behind it. And then kind of taking it even further, this is a picture taken in the Philippines. This is a mum holding her son who's dead. He's just been shot on the street. And in the Philippines, the president, Rodrigo Duterte, his policy is, he's basically said to his country, he's currently the president now, he said to the whole country, if you know anybody who is involved in drugs, whether they take drugs or whether they supply drugs, you are allowed to kill them. You're allowed to shoot them, and there will be no criminal sanction for you. So you can go out on the streets and kill anybody you like if you think they're involved in drugs. That is his policy, basically. And he's been there since 2016. The strange thing about this is you might think that's terrible, and how can they let that happen? His approval ratings are really high. They love him over there. But there is a human rights travesty going on right now in over there. People are being killed on the street and for coming into contact with drugs. It's kind of the worst it can possibly get. But the media have a role to play in this as well, and this is quite an amusing set of headlines that go back to I think it was probably the 1960s, these were the types of headlines which were starting to be generated. I mean, I love girl gives birth to a frog, LSD made me a prostitute, LSD fed ape rapes TV actress. I mean, it's all incredibly nonsensical stuff. But it was kind of the way that the media was starting to change the whole perception about drugs. Because, you know, before the war on drugs, the drugs were used and were accepted. It's only this kind of this rhetoric by the government and by the media that was causing this to happen. But it wasn't even just back then. This is a little bit more recent. I think this was around about 2015 when legal highs were very much a thing. I mean, they still are, but they were very much in the news back then. There's a legal drug team ripped his scrotum off. This is a completely fabricated story by The Sun. I don't think anybody has ever pulled off their testicles by, you know, because they were high on drugs. I mean, I just don't know why anybody would want to do that. It's like I mean, it's ridiculous. But this is another type of story that was being peddled by 2013 is right up there. So that's been peddled by the mainstream press, and not much has changed. Maybe the kind of sensational headlines have been toned down slightly. But there's still kind of the main message is still there, particularly from the right-wing press, Sun, Mail, Telegraph, places like that, who really want to kind of portray these types of messages. If we think about our recent leaders, and I've gone back to Cameron, but you know, we could go back before then, but I thought it was interesting to look at where the kind of political climate is right now. So if you go back to David Cameron, this is what he said in 2012. I don't support decriminalisation. We have a policy which actually is working in Britain. No, it's not. But that's what he said. What's interesting about Cameron is when he was like a junior minister, before he wasn't really known at all, and before he kind of entered into the leadership contest, which eventually took him to be the leader of the Conservative Party, he was very much pro looking at re-examining drug policy, and in fact he supported things like potentially supporting decriminalisation, and he has publicly said that. It was only when he became more mainstream, and when I think he knew that he had a possibility of becoming the leader of the Conservative Party, he just changed it to kind of turn it around completely. And then, you know, so through his leadership, absolutely no chance of any change. Theresa May then succeeded him. She was the Home Secretary, the longest serving Home Secretary that we've ever had in this country. We all know Theresa May. I mean, she is straight down the line. It's right that we continue to fight the war against drugs. Based on what? Who knows? Who knows other than, you know, another kind of political incentive there. She carried that opinion into her short leadership of the country. Moving on, I mean, I don't know what to say about this man. There's so many things about this man, but this is what he said now. And this is recent. This is like just a few months ago. This is when the government released a new drug strategy. And his quote from that is, "We are going to look at new ways of penalising them, things that will actually interfere with their lives. So we will look at taking away passports and driving licence." I mean, this is the most insane policy that you can think of. What he's trying to do here is say that the reason for all the harm that's created by drugs, the reason why we have supply chains and criminals and, you know, drug-related offences and drug-related deaths and all the harm that's caused by that is because people, middle-class white people at parties, want to take drugs, and we'll punish them by taking away their passports and their drug. You know, it's utterly ridiculous. And he's trying to deflect the attention away from the 50 years of failure that the successive governments have overseen, where drug policy has not worked. He's trying to blame it on people who are using drugs and not for the policy itself. If we think about what options we've got ahead of us and look at where the opposition stand on this, to be honest, it's no more encouraging. The Labour are very clear that they are not interested in looking at drug policy reform at all. Certainly not Keir Starmer. He's been very clear about that, as you see. And in actual fact, I actually think it's probably less likely that Labour would change drug policy than even the Tories would. And it's quite a demoralising thought to think that even with a change in government, we wouldn't really see much difference, certainly not in the near future. It's worth noting other political parties are much more liberal, and in particular the Lib Dems, as we know, but really the Green Party, who have got a very, very progressive drug reform policy. But unfortunately, I think it's unlikely at the moment that those parties will get into government. But who knows? Maybe things will change. So just a brief history on modern UK drugs policy here. Again, I'll keep it top level. These are sort of some of the key things that have happened in the last 100 years. And actually, the four acts and the things here are actually pretty progressive up until sort of late 1960s. It's pretty good stuff. It's all these reports are certainly based on evidence and trying to solve a problem in a kind of a sensible, rational, evidence-based way. Particularly looking at things like, the first Dangerous Drugs Act. I think it was recognised that there was some issues with drugs, and they tried to put some regulation around it to try and control it in a very sensible way. As we go through, doctors were allowed to prescribe controlled drugs to people who were perhaps having problematic use. So particularly opiates, prescribing opiates to people so they can control and regulate and have a much better way of dealing with their problem than having to go to the black market. And 1967, the Dangerous Drugs Act was the start of drug treatment centres within the NHS. So really recognising that the problematic drug use is a health problem, and people should be given treatment and care and support for that, so they can get over those problems that in any other way, just like any other thing that people go to the NHS for. Certainly not looking at it as a criminal justice system. So then we kind of come into obviously 1971. When Nixon declares his war on drugs, and the UK just decides to follow, just absolutely go along with exactly what they've said in the States. And so they brought in the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971. And this is where the drug classification system came into play, and the drug scheduling system, which I'm going to show you and just kind of talk through that in a moment. And the purpose of those classification system is there to kind of determine the supposed harms caused by drugs and kind of rank them according to harms, and to kind of say what the criminal sanctions should be if you are caught in possession or supplying. The drug schedules, which sit alongside drug classifications, are there to again determine which drugs have got therapeutic benefits and should be allowed to be and can be used as a medicine, and should be allowed to have scientific research done on them. So that's the drug schedules, but I'll come on to that in a second. We've had more legislation since then. We've had successive drug strategies over this time, which has slowly shifted the focus of drug treatment onto criminal justice. It's also put more emphasis on what's known as recovery, which is actually known as abstinence. So trying to make people become completely free of drugs, rather than sort of a maintenance program, which does exist within treatment right now. And only until recently, actually, funding had been cut year on year for drug treatment services over the last 20 years. The last drug strategy actually had an increase in funding for drug treatment services. but it's only kind of come up towards where it was. It hasn't really got anywhere near where it should be. That's why drug treatment services are underfunded, and too many people are not getting the help and support that they need. Then the most recent piece of legislation is the 2016 Psychoactive Substances Bill, or Substances Act, should I say, which is bizarre. So David loves talking about this. He calls it the worst. It's called the worst bit of drug legislation in the history of the world, or something like that. But basically, this act was brought in because at the time there was all this attention on legal highs, as they were called, or novel psychoactive substances. There were head shops all over the country where people were able to go and buy hundreds of different types of drugs which hadn't been banned because they, very, kind of scientifically made so that they kind of avoided any of the existing regulations. So the government brought in this act to basically ban anything that has a psychoactive effect, except of course for alcohol and tobacco and caffeine, because they are all good drugs and people should do that as much as you like, but everything else should be banned. I think one of the big drivers for this act was an attempt to close down the head shops, to get rid of them, which is what it did do. I think almost overnight, all the head shops were closed down because of this, because it was illegal for them. And what effect did that have? Well, people going to those head shops for their so-called legal highs were at least going to a safe environment that wasn't controlled by criminal incentives or criminal gangs or anything like that. Those shops were being run by people who knew what they were doing, knew what they were talking about, were people who were probably using those drugs themselves, certainly didn't wish harm on anybody, certainly weren't interested in people kind of, doing themselves harm, doing themselves damage, and were there to kind of at least kind of provide some good advice and guidance about what you're doing. And instead now, people haven't just suddenly said, oh, well, these novel psychoactive substances are banned, so therefore they must be bad, and therefore I'm not going to do it anymore. That's not happening. People are still wanting to use those drugs, going to get them from the same place, drug dealers who are also dealing all sorts of other things as well, and have no idea what they're buying, no kind of help in terms of, is this good, is this the right thing to do for me, etc. And also all it's done is driven all that drug use into the criminal underworld, and with that comes all the inherent problems that you get with the black market. So it's had this kind of perverse effect at the same time as having this ridiculous, like, everything that's psychoactive must be banned. We even had some discussions around, what is psychoactive. If you smell a flower like a rose and it smells nice, that is like a psychoactive effect on the brain. So, are we saying that roses are banned? It's just a ridiculous policy. Coming on to the classifications that I was just talking about, you might be aware of this, I don't know, but there's the three main classes of drugs here, and you can see the drugs that are included in those classifications. Now, again, this is not based on any scientific evidence at all. These classifications were in place since 1971, I think, around about that time. It's not based on the evidence at all. We have, in Class A, we have drugs quite rightly in Class A, like crack cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine. But sitting alongside that, we've got MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, and a few others, where there is very little evidence to show that those are harmful drugs at all. They're not harmful drugs. They really aren't. They certainly shouldn't be in Class A. You certainly shouldn't get, if you're caught in possession, 7 years in jail because you like to take magic mushrooms, which grow in the ground and have no threats to your health and well-being at all. The only change that's happened to the classification, the only time a drug has moved between the classifications, I'm pretty sure, is cannabis, which under Tony Blair was declassified to a Class C drug, which was a really good move at that time. You know, I mean, that was recognizing that cannabis is not really as harmful as those other drugs in that class, and should be declassified to Class C. But that was quickly reversed when Gordon Brown became the Prime Minister, and I think he did it again because I think he wanted to win over the right-wing press to try and win the election, which he ultimately failed to do. He wanted to win over the press. He did a deal with, I think it was The Sun, and he said, if I reclassify back to Class B, you'll support me in my election campaign. They said yes, they would. They instantly didn't do that. They instantly didn't back him at all. And all we get is cannabis back up in Class B, which it definitely does not belong there. Going into the schedules quickly now. So as you remember, I said the schedules are about trying to recognize whether any drug has a therapeutic benefit or not. So can it be a medicine? And these schedules kind of work the other way around. So Schedule 1 is basically saying that any drugs that are in Schedule 1 are very harmful drugs that have no therapeutic benefit at all. That's what Schedule 1 is for. And as a result, it is almost impossible to do research on these drugs. And there are all sorts of regulations and things that you have to do if you want to store them in an academic institute or something like that. So in Schedule 1, we have, and these are just examples because schedules are huge. There's not just psychoactive drugs, but all sorts of other drugs fit into the schedules. But in terms of the drugs that we're interested in, examples that are in Schedule 1, LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA. So by being in Schedule 1, that's saying there's no therapeutic benefit whatsoever. Now we know that that could not be further from the truth. These drugs have got so much therapeutic potential that could help so many people in the world, particularly suffering from mental health issues, particularly things like severe treatment-resistant depression, major depressive disorder, anxiety, PTSD, as well as other physical conditions as well, addiction as well. These drugs. There is so much potential, and you might have heard already. Actually, I think did you have Sam Gandhi yesterday? Yeah. So the amount of research that is starting to happen around these drugs to show how powerful they could be for people with these very, very debilitating illnesses that also cause people to die. It's all going on, but there's Schedule 1. So it's making it extremely difficult to do research. David Nutt is one of the very few people who has managed to do research on Schedule 1 drugs. He'll probably tell you about it later on. But he'll tell you how difficult it has been to do that. Cannabis, again, is the one that has moved recently. Cannabis used to be Schedule 1 drug, but until just over 3 years ago, it was descheduled to Schedule 2. That was in recognition that actually cannabis probably does have medicinal properties. I mean, of course it does. And there are millions of people around the world using cannabis, not for a recreational high, but because they need it just to kind of cope with everyday life. Cannabis has been a medicine for over 2,000 years. It's only just recently, this very short period recently, where the world has suddenly decided that it's an evil drug. It's in Schedule 2, which means it's better. It can be used as a medicine, but there's still a lot of regulations, a lot of restrictions around how it can be used. So just like the drug classification system, the drug schedules are not based on evidence. They're based on a long-standing political perverse motivation to keep these drugs away from people and to make sure people think that they are very bad things to be doing. So what needs to change? I mean, this is what we're trying to do at Drug Science, and I'll tell you a bit more about this now. So our tagline is the truth about drugs, as I explained. Our vision is to see a world where drug control is rational and evidence-based, where drug use is better informed and people who use drugs are understood, and really importantly, where drugs are used to heal and not harm. And to do that, we basically want to build the evidence to show that, and to dispel the myths, and to prove to policymakers that change needs to happen, because at the moment, our drug policy, our laws, the whole approach is causing way more harm than it's doing good. So we're really just trying to build the evidence, and we're trying to democratize that evidence as widely as possible to our key audiences, as the general public, the media, and policymakers, and hopefully to enact a positive change in those areas. Just a few things that we've done. This is a highly cited graph from a paper that was produced by Drug Science, actually before my time at Drug Science. But one of the first things that David Knight and his team did when we were there. Are people familiar with this? A few people nodding. Okay. And basically, again, David will explain how this was constructed. It's a very scientific method of assessing the true harms of drugs against a whole range of different measures, not just physical measures, but also societal measures, things like the impact on the society as a whole, on the economy, on people's job prospects and their criminal records, and all sorts of things kind of thrown into the mix. And then it's produced this graph which has ranked all the drugs, or the most common drugs, against the actual harms. And the most kind of stark thing that we can see from this graph is that alcohol is the most dangerous drug that we have. Now, I should say right now, nobody at Drug Science is saying that alcohol is bad and nobody should drink it. That's not what we're saying here at all. What we're saying is, compared to all the other drugs, alcohol causes more harm than the others. You'd expect things like heroin, crack cocaine, methamphetamine to be highly ranking, which they are. But if we go slightly further down, we see cannabis is like halfway down there. And compare cannabis to alcohol, it's a small proportion of harm against alcohol. If we go further down the list, down to the end, we see ecstasy, LSD, magic mushrooms. They are right down the scale. They cause virtually no harm at all to anybody or to society. And yet, as we saw from the previous slides, they are deemed to be the most dangerous drugs. They're deemed to be alongside the most dangerous drugs in our society. And just kind of shows that drug policy is kind of reversed. It's flipped around. We have alcohol. I mean, I'm pretty sure if alcohol was invented today, it would be banned. It wouldn't be legally available. But alcohol is very much accepted, promoted. There's huge marketing behind it. There's a culture of drinking in this country in particular, but in many other countries. Again, I'm not saying drinking alcohol is bad, but compared to what we think about the other drugs, it doesn't make any sense. And the fact that things like magic mushrooms and LSD and MDMA, you can get massive jail sentences for possession or whatever, is just doesn't make any sense. So that's a very well known graph. Just want to make sure you're aware about when we use different terminology, because at Drug Science, what we want to see is state regulation for all drugs. And so I'll explain what that means, but the common phrases that you might hear of here, or particularly the difference between decriminalization and legalization, there's a difference there. When we talk about decriminalization, what we mean is that the drug laws exist, but you're not perversely affected by those drug laws if you are using drugs, particularly if you have problematic use, and rather than being pushed into the criminal justice system, you are given help through the health system instead, and it's a much better way of dealing with problematic drug use. But also in terms of decriminalisation, if people have small quantities of drugs for personal possession, things like that, you should not be treated as a criminal as a result, particularly in the context of everything else I've just been talking about in terms of the relative harms between those drugs. Criminalisation is, as we have it at the moment, certainly in this country and many other countries in the world, what that means is total prohibition across all drugs, completely ignoring evidence, completely ignoring that, some things are better than others, completely ignoring that alcohol can cause much more harm than other drugs. It's just prohibition. The term legalization, which is one that we generally don't tend to use very much at drug science because it's a bit too broad in terms of what it can mean. Legalization could mean anything from a completely free market where anybody can take any drugs in any place or whatever, and that's fine at one end of the scale. But on the other end, which is where we sit really, is what we call state regulation, where we think every type of drug should be regulated, available but regulated against the evidence about that drug. So an example, alcohol is a very well-regulated drug. You can only buy it in certain places at certain times. You have to be a certain age. The packaging comes with very clear details about what it is, what's in it, what the strength is. You have a good understanding of, if you drink a bottle of beer, what's going to happen to you. If you drink a bottle of whiskey, what's going to happen to you. You can make those choices based on very clear labeling. That's what state regulation is. Now you could have that for all types of drugs. It would be based on the evidence behind it. That's what we should see, because if we did that, then the criminal market would be virtually eliminated. There wouldn't really be a black market. There might be a little bit, but really not very much. People would be better informed and can make informed choices about what they want to do. And they might think to themselves, "Oh, I'm not going to go out and drink 8 pints of lager. I'm actually going to go and take some MDMA and have just as good a time. And actually, it's going to be better for me." And also, we could obviously tax it. So the government would be much better off from a financial point of view. There would be less harm. People wouldn't be put in jail. We wouldn't have the huge the costs of having massively overpopulated prisons. And we would obviously, as I said, make money from taxation. So that sort of state regulation is what we think is what we really need in this country. That is a bit like actually not quite that. This is what kind of happened in Portugal. They have been pursuing this decriminalisation approach for like 20 years now. And they actually did this not because they were trying to address their drug problem, which they had a very significant drug problem in Portugal, but they also had a very significant economic problem. Their economy was on its knees at the time, and they knew that they needed to do something different to tackle that. And they decided to decriminalise drugs for all these reasons that I've been talking about, to not put people into criminal justice if they have problematic use, to put them into the health system. So they reduced their. So what did they do? They have the second lowest fatal overdose rate in Europe now, which is phenomenal. Their bloodborne viruses like HIV and Hep B and C have been virtually eliminated now, because it's a very common way of contracting Hep C and HIV through sharing injecting equipment. Drug-related crimes significantly decreased. Why do people need to commit crimes anymore? That's fine. And incarceration rates have dropped massively. Portugal is like a massive success story and like the perfect experiment on how a different approach when it comes to drug policy can make a massive improvement in everything, health of a country, the health of the country, the economic status of the country, the respect of that country, all these things. And what other evidence do we need to say that that's going to work? It's been happening for 20 years. It's a no-brainer. And we hope that people can start to see that, the people who can make a difference. Just quick on this, principles of control legislation, I think it should cover all drugs, including alcohol and tobacco. So as I said, not just the illegal drugs at the moment. We should optimize health against the criminal justice system. We need to make it much easier to offer medical, to develop these drugs with therapeutic potential, make them into medicines, to be able to do research, to be able to prove that they are very effective medicines. The law should be proportionate to the risks, just as I was saying, and we should respect human rights, unlike President Duterte in the Philippines. So I think this is my last thing here is about drug science's strategic areas of priority. So I just wanted to tell you what we're actually doing at drug science, because it's not just kind of some thinking and some telling people. We're actually doing some stuff. So these are the key areas that we are focusing on. Medical cannabis. So with medical cannabis, 3 years ago, just over 3 years ago, medical cannabis was legalized essentially. It was descheduled to Schedule 2. It could be prescribed to patients. That was a great step forward, we thought, but in actual fact, not a lot changed back then. It was very expensive for people to get medical cannabis. You can only really get it through the private sector, because the NHS, despite the fact they tell you they can prescribe it, they're not prescribing it at all. And people were still using the black market to access their cannabis for therapeutic reasons. So we've started a project which is collecting evidence to show that it does have health improvements for people who are using cannabis. And this evidence has never existed in the UK ever before. It's the very first time. This project is a registry that collects real-world data and monitors the health outcome measures as people are prescribed, as they're using their medicine. We have almost 3,000 people now, all contributing their personal data, their health outcome data, to show that cannabis has a statistically significant health improvement in people that it's prescribed to. And that is evidence that hasn't existed in the UK before. There's a number of other things we're doing. We're looking particularly at childhood epilepsy. You may have seen high-profile cases in the news of very young, very sick children who have many epileptic seizures a day, sometimes 100 a day, who are often hospitalized, who are often given very debilitating opiate-based drugs to stop them from having seizures. They're given medical cannabis, and the lives of these children are changed within a matter of weeks, really. Their lives are changed. They stop having seizures. They're not debilitated by sort of these powerful drugs which have loads of horrible side effects. And the whole families are, not just the child, but the whole families are living a much more normalized life as a result. And we believe that cannabis should be available on the NHS for those children. It's not at the moment. The NHS, so the families are having to go to Holland, which costs a huge amount of money, or they have to buy illegal drugs, which almost all of them do not want to do, but they're forced to. It's the only way they can get this kind of life-changing, even life-saving medicine for their very young children. And we think it's one of the biggest priority areas as far as we're concerned. We're also doing a lot of work around medical psychedelics, and this is kind of really interesting aspect of drug discovery. As we know, there are many psychedelic drugs that could be used for treating people with very severe problems, as I said. This is a sort of an emerging industry. It's kind of a few years behind cannabis. Psychedelic drugs are still Schedule 1, as I showed. We want them to be Schedule 2, so we can do more research and so that it can be prescribed legally as a medicine. We're not quite there yet, but we're trying to, again, build the evidence to kind of show that is going to happen. And I think within a few years, hopefully within a few years, maybe 2 or 3 years, psychedelics will be descheduled and become medicines, which will make a massive change to many people in the world. Number three is what we call enhanced harm reduction. And by this, we mean people who have problematic drug use, who are addicted to drugs, particularly opiate drugs, are at risk of overdose, one of the biggest killers, one of the reasons why drug-related deaths are increasing year on year. In other parts of the world, they have introduced what's called either a drug consumption room, also known as overdose prevention center, or safer injecting site, or one or two other names for it. Essentially, it's a drug consumption room. They have them in other parts of the country in areas where there's a high prevalence of injecting drug use. And it's shown to have a dramatic impact on reducing the amount of overdoses that happen in that locality. And then also lots of other benefits, like not having discarded drug paraphernalia, in public. People who want to take drugs like that, who need to, can go to a safe space. They can do it. They will not have an overdose because there's medical assistance there all the time. And they can do it safely and in a good place. And at the same time, they will have contact with a health worker who can try to help them to think about how can they change things, or how can they get the right treatment to overcome those problems. And we want to see drug consumption rooms here in the UK. They're illegal at the moment. The political opinion is changing. There seems to be more will politically to be able to do that, especially up in Scotland. So what we are hoping to do at Drug Science in the very near future is open the very first drug consumption room in the UK, which will be an academic-led initiative. So it will essentially be a research pilot project, but it will be a functioning drug consumption room. And we will monitor the impact that it has on that locality. We'll look at how does it reduce perhaps overdose rates, or ambulance call-outs, or littering in public places, or any other benefits to society. And that's something that we're really kind of passionate about at the moment. Education is kind of like the raison d'etre of drug science. We're providing evidence. We want people to know about it. We do that through our website. So if you want to know about any drug, we've got our drug information pages. It tells you everything you need to know, but just the facts. It's not got any opinions to it. It's not got. Doesn't try and persuade you to do one thing or another. It just tells you what that drug is. If you take it, this is what will happen to you, or this is the likely effects, should I say, from a scientific point of view, and is just it's the truth about drugs. And it's not what you will see from the government. It's not what you'll see on websites like Talk to Frank, or other places where it's trying to say, don't do drugs, don't do drugs. And lastly, very lastly, and I've been talking for a while, but influence, again, everything we do at Drug Science is we want policymakers to see that and start to think about why policy at the moment is not working, why it needs to change, what potential benefits we could realize if we did have a changed drug policy. So we do that by talking directly to politicians. We actually have an MP as one of our trustees. We engage with more and more politicians within Westminster. We hold briefing events, all sorts of things. We also want to encourage the media to report things accurately, not have these sensationalized headlines, but talk about things in a sensible, rational way. And we want the public to have a better understanding of drugs, so that, as I said, they can make an informed choice. It's their choice. Everybody has a choice of what they want to do, but they need to be informed so they can make the best choice. And so that's what we want to do there. So that, I think, oh no, it doesn't. There's one last thing, one last slide. And I put this in because I wanted to just come back to a little story about what this all means. What does it mean in reality? why are we here? Why are we doing this? This is Robert. This is back in 2016. He was a cannabis user, and so he had a dealer he regularly used. Went to see his dealer to score some cannabis. Where on one occasion he was offered ecstasy as well. He thought, okay, yeah, why not? I'll take some of that. That's great. So he bought some ecstasy, but he died because it wasn't ecstasy. It was fentanyl, and fentanyl is a drug that will kill you. And the reason he died was because he wanted ecstasy. He wanted MDMA. Probably the dealer probably didn't even know that it was cut with fentanyl. But it was because he had to get it from this criminal world. He took something that he didn't realize what it was, and it killed him. And that did not need to happen. and what, why? I mean, Robert was just, a young lad and just doing what he wanted to do. And why should he have died? Why should that have happened? It would not have happened if we had a much better approach to drug policy. So that is it. Thank you very much. And any questions?